So in 3.21 Crucible, I decided to play Rage Vortex Berserker as my character, having never even heard of the skill before. I typically only play one main character per league, so this was my league starter that I would transition into my league, and I'd say I play pretty casually, being 4 weeks into the league and not having reached 40 challenges or earned a mage blood yet. Rage Vortex has been an interesting build with a very unique playstyle that I haven't really experienced in Path of Exile yet, and I have to say it is one of the most enjoyable that I have. It's not a great mapper, but it's a fairly solid all-rounder. I feel it can tackle a pretty enormous breadth of content at a fairly competent level, so long as you're willing to play to its strength and be patient with its sometimes awkward limitations. And it's not the strongest or fastest build I've ever played, but it's definitely fun, at least to me. And so I think if you're looking for a quote-unquote melee build, with a slower pace using a slightly more involved playstyle, Rage Vortex might be worth checking out. It's not for everybody, but for those who it is for, you'll find a lot of fun. I'll go over the quick basic premise of the build and how it functions, a quick overview of how I leveled, the staple items of the build, the gem setup, Astral Tree, and a couple of the defenses, a quick look at the POB and the build's strengths and some of its weaknesses. So to start off, Rage Vortex, it is an ability that has the melee tag and the attack tags. This throws out a cyclone in front of you, sacrificing rage and dealing more damage per rage spent. And so the idea is to increase your max rage as high as possible, so I have 90, and then sacrificing as much as possible. So I'm throwing out 22 rage cyclones, or vortexes rather, and this gives me an extra 5% more damage per rage sacrifice. So that's over 100% more damage at maximum rage when I throw out my cyclone. So the staple of the build to enable this is Calm Spirit. Calm Spirit turns your rage regen, or life regen into rage regen, and that means we don't have life regen anymore. So how do we overcome that? We overcome that with a combination of a few things. Dissolution of the flesh. So this prevents damage from actually hitting your life pool and instead reserves life. And then in conjunction with that, we take Eternal Youth, which means that ES applies to our life regen instead. So constantly I am regenerating enough to overcome the Rite of Ruin degeneration. And this is how we work around the Calm Spirit. I think this tech is pretty common if you check any of the PoE Ninja builds. Pretty much everyone is using the setup. It's unusual because ES applies to life. Energy Shield regen tags on your item will actually speed up your life regen, the actual red part. However, the life regeneration itself is what determines how fast your rage regen is. So while this actually helps us survive and avoid degens, this actually does lower our rage regen, but it feels fine for the most part because you'll be able to regenerate rage through the amount we already have, on top of rage support in your gem setup. So I actually started leveling this doing a pure fizz. I did that by using Ulnatol's Kiss. I did a pure fizz impale leveling build. I went from Ground Slam to Earth Shatter, and I did that all the way up until I was able to afford Calm Spirit, which I bought at League Start for about 20C, and the Red Blade Banner, plus a Siege X that had like 180 DPS or something. I used that all the way up until red maps. I could push to about T14s or 15s when I started to feel the damage fall off, and I was just farming currency until I was able to afford the Void Forge. This is the staple of the build for damage. All of our damage comes from Void Forge, and we lean into that super heavily. So the other thing is we take Elemental Equilibrium, because the random damage from Void Forge that's converted allows us to apply exposure. This is how we apply our exposure. And we also take the Interrogation Small Cluster Jewel, which gives us Secrets of Suffering, allowing us to Scorch, Brittle, and Sap instead of Ignite, Chill, Freeze, or Shock. Losing those is not that bad because Brittle is absolutely absurd. Sap is a crazy defense layer, And Scorch also really helps out the damage with the elemental resistance lowered. I went with Berserker. You could probably do this on Slayer. Berserker is the obvious choice because of the natural rage regen and the bonuses to rage. Crave the Slaughter was my first to start generating the rage and give maximum rage. This really helps you stabilize your output for rage and makes the build much more viable, much more quickly. And I was doing Rage Vortex around level 72. Second was Warbringer, allowing you to start sacrificing rage. You could take Warbringer first instead of Crave the Slaughter if you don't have Calm Spirit, because with the Red Blade banner, your war cries have infinite power, and you can basically use this to recharge your regen all the time. And you can see that I actually still use Red Blade banner in my offhand, because when I run out of rage by spending it quickly enough, I can weapon swap a war cry to get maximum rage immediately, which is pretty cool. There is also Aspect of Carnage. This one's go-to for Berserker. Just gives you insane amounts of damage, makes you a little bit squishier, but what can you do? And then the final Ascendancy node was Rite of Ruin, which absolutely destroys your life. With 90 rage, your degen is insane. And so that's where Eternal Youth and Dissolution of the Flesh come into play. So with that said, keeping that in mind, you have to play this kind of like an ES build, because when you take damage, your life is going to drop. Your reserve is going to play like ES, and you need to wait 2 seconds before the reserve disappears. So you kind of jump around, put your Rage Vortexes back off, and wait for your Vortexes to blend everything to death. So that's the idea. Going back to items here, I have a Void Forge. It's got a pretty decent Crucible tree here. Global damage, increased crits, Mana Leech. I have a bunch of reserve mana, but this actually helps stabilize during mapping, makes it feel a lot better. And explicit elemental damage. So you can see that my Void Forge actually has 770% of physical is extra damage. Ideally, you could get a 15% modifier. And if you're extremely rich, I think ideally, you could probably get an elemental penetration passive on here, or an additional 15% explicit physical and chaos damage modifiers, and they do stack, which would give you over 800%, which is absurd. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to craft one. I've thrown divines after divines at it, and I've kind of just given up for now. There is our helmet, which has Rage Vortex, sacrifices an extra 5% of rage, and this increases the amount of damage you do astronomically. This is the best enchant. And I just hit it with a few essences from Mana Reserve, got some max life and resistances on it. It's got enough reserve for me to enable my aura setup. You don't have to do this. You can probably get it with a cheaper aura setup using a banner instead, but I'm running a purity, so I need the extra reserve, since I'm not taking anything on the tree. Our armor is a simple 6-link with 2 Conqueror mods. One for additional curse and additional critical strike chance. It's crazy damage. It's got a little bit of regen on it, a little bit of life and resistance. It's nothing crazy. Amulet, flat physical damage, life regen, and your resistances you might in extra attributes, which really helps. The anointment is Panopticon, because unfortunately this is still a melee build, so we still have to crutch on totems because GGG won't give us damage elsewhere. Rings are flat damage, life and resistances. Got some blight anoints for AFK tower farming it. Got chaos resistance on this ring. Life, regen, a little bit of accuracy. And I got a hunter mod for exerted damage and crafted on elemental damage with attack skills. I think for rings you could probably do crit multi instead, or added flat damage on top of that, but you're looking at extremely expensive rings at that point. There's the gloves. The gloves are where I choose to get elemental weakness on hit from. I picked these up early in the league for 2 divines. They're probably a little bit cheaper now. You could also get double curse gloves, but those are going to be significantly more expensive, and I don't think really worth it because I have a different setup for my second curse. Bear's Girdle. This belt is pretty much non-negotiable. You could get a Stygian Vice instead, but the amount of rage that this gives and the amount of flat damage it gives you is astronomical. The amount of damage this spell gives us is best in slot, and I don't think it's worth giving up for a Darkness Enthroned or a Stygian Vice with flat damage on it. These are my crappy boots. They've got life, movement speed, resistance, and life regen. It's got action speed on the implicits, and ideally, you could get some elemental avoidance on it, but I actually solved that through my gems on my passive tree, which I will show afterwards. And my flash setup, I've got Chaos Risk from the Amethyst, Granite for immunity to bleed, reduced effect curses on my Basalt Flask, attack speed on Silver, this is purely for DPS, and a Bottled Faith, this is for bossing damage, and it does give an absurd amount of damage. Your uptime on Bottled Faith might not be super great. You don't have to do this. You could probably pick a different flask. You could use Oriath Sand for clear, or you could just use like a Lion's Roar or something. Now, with regards to gem setup, my main link is Anomalous Rage Vortex, Trinity, which is always full proc thanks to Void Forge, increased critical damage support. You could probably replace this with Awakened Melee Physical, but this does give a healthy chunk of damage, and I'm totally okay with it. Rage supports. This gives a crazy amount of flat physical damage, and helps with rage regen as well, so hitting stuff will just constantly keep you capped. Awakened Elemental Damage, especially at level 5 or 6, since it makes us immune to Elemental Reflect, completely removing any need to pay attention to Reflect mods. And Bloodthirst support, which in conjunction with our Petrified Blood setup, this gives a crazy amount of flat damage as well, and if you haven't noticed, the pattern is stacking flat damage on this as much as possible. My totem setup is in my weapon. I've got Ancestral Warchief and Ancestral Protector linked up to a Mark on hit. This one's Divergent for increased damage taken. Assassin's Mark. So this gives us extra crit chance, multi, and power charges when you hit enemies. It's really good for bossing. Multiple totems, so you can put down both types of totems at once. And life tap, because we have so little mana that we actually cannot cast Assassin's Mark with mana. And if I were to put anything else here, I wouldn't be able to proc Assassin's Mark half the time, so I put this in here to fix that. In my helmet is my aura setup. I've got a level 3 Enlighten, Petrified Blood for the defense, Determination, extra armor layer, Herald of Purity for more physical damage. This applies before conversions. Precision and Vitality linked to Arrogance. So we lose about 800 life off that, but it's not a big deal. And in my gloves, I've got Intimidating Cry, Berserk, Leap Slam, and Molten Shell. These are all my active abilities. There's no life tap linked to them. They are cheap enough for me to cast, but I cannot spam them without life tap. Originally, I had a life tap in here, but I chose to take it out to fit in the extra Herald of Purity, which gave me a significant boost of damage, and I think it is worth it. So quickly looking at the passive tree. This is what my passive tree looks like. Nothing too crazy here. We path up here for Eternal Youth. I take as many jewel sockets as I can fit. And a couple of the nodes of note are Berserking for maximum rage. This is pretty much non-negotiable. And I chose to take Intimidated while you have rage. You can alternatively choose to take monsters can't block your attacks for quality of life, but I think the Intimidation for free is crazy, because even though I'm running Intimidating Cry on this build, it makes it significantly more consistent since Intimidating Cry has an 8-second cooldown. Prismatic Skin for max resist, Corrupted Blood immunity from Mastery since I have so many unique jewels. Elemental Equilibrium for the exposure. Crystal Skin for avoidance. And I cap out using this part of the tree. If you were to get this from your gear, you could probably cut this out, but it doesn't really hurt because of the extra max res. I take a bunch of the life nodes. The sword nodes, Blade of Cunning and Blade Master. The 2 sword masteries I took are Frenzy Charge when you hit a unique enemy, and increased critical strike chance, but the reduction in multiplier. The increased critical strike chance helps us by basically removing the need to get it anywhere else on the tree, since it gives you so much. There's the Fortify node. I took this specifically for melee hits Fortify. You still get 23 fortification from here. Otherwise, you have to put Fortify in your links, and that gives us a significant reduction in damage. So taking it out of your gem and placing it on your tree is a lot more helpful, and you get 3 max fortification out of that anyways. Call to Arms is not mandatory. This makes your Warcries instant, but I feel like the build suffers greatly from mobility issues already, and just popping this in makes the build feel better. So even though you don't need it, I do recommend taking it because it feels really bad if you don't. Aside from that, you've got Disemboweling, probably the biggest crit node that I pick up. Dismembering, same thing. And for the cluster setup, it is a large cluster jewel. I have Calamitous, Devastator, and Smite the Weak. I'm in particular looking for Calamitous and Devastator, because Devastator gives us Explode on hit, so I don't need to get this on the chest piece. It really helps with clear, and I don't need to use Oria's End by using this. Because we are an attack build, we have the benefit of using it. Could you get a different node to increase your damage? I think so, but I personally think that this is a very low investment way of getting Explode, because I bought this cluster jewel for like 60 chaos. Calamitous gives us increased effect of non-damaging ailments, which increases the effect of Sap, Brittle, and Scorch, makes it a lot more consistent to apply maximum effect. And the Interrogation, which is for Secrets of Suffering. Now, the unique jewels I took are Grand Spectrums. So, aside from Dissolution of the Flesh, I have a Grand Spectrum for avoiding elemental ailments. I get 36% off this, 30% off this, and an additional 36% off this. So I'm actually using 2 Grand Spectrums like avoiding elemental ailments. Again, you can get these on your boots instead, either with the Eldritch Implicit or with the Crafted modifier. The Crafted modifier with the Implicit altogether could get you about 50%. You could get some extra on your chest, and then use one of these, and you should be able to cap out elemental ailments avoidance pretty quickly. And for my 3rd Grand Spectrum, I took increased maximum life, so 15% off 1 jewel, which is pretty good. I have Forbidden Flame and Flesh. My setup chooses Tukahama War's Herald. This is the the Ascendancy passive on the Chieftain's tree, which gives you plus 100% effect of your totem buffs, which is basically like having 2 extra Panopticons, and so our damage while totems are down is kind of bad. As soon as we throw our totems down, our damage skyrockets. Especially when you manage to drop a Val Ancestral War Chief, you will feel the damage difference once you drop that and go Berserk. And that will increase the amount of damage you can do during your burst. We also take Soul of Steel. I don't know why that's unapplied right now. I take this for extra resistances. And you can see that I have 82% fire resist, 80 cold, and 81 lightning. 1 from the tree, 1 from the passive node here, and the lightning node comes from the helmet enchant from the Eldritch Implicit. Got decent armor. It's all coming from Determination, a little bit of the boost from the Soul of Steel and the Life and Armor node. And being ailment immune is something I very highly recommend, because degens are absolutely lethal to this build. Since life regen doesn't matter, all you have to play with is your remaining life reserve thanks to the Dissolution of the Flesh, and mitigating that as much as possible is a priority so you don't explode randomly in maps. Having a flask with poison immunity is super helpful, and for your Pantheons, I took Arakali to reduce damage over time, give chaos resistance on it, remove debuffs faster so that helps with the non-elemental ailment dots, and Soul of Shikari to help deal with poisons when the Amethyst Flask isn't up for whatever reason. This really helped smooth out my leveling experience and my early mapping experience until I could get some Chaos Res, of which I'm still not capped, but while my Chaos Flask is up at 54 Chaos Res, and I'm capped against damage over time, which is still pretty useful. And my flasks have flash charge on crit strike, so they are full pretty much all the time. Taking a quick look at path of building here, I have Rage Vortex sets for Rage Storm as my main skill. And for my configuration, I have enemies set to Guardian / Pinnacle Boss with 25% resistance. That's because that's to emulate elemental equilibrium hitting them. You can drop this off. This is just to help give me a more realistic idea of what the setup is. Power and frenzy charges are off. Onslaught should be off. So life tap, fortified, 90 rage, and crit recently. 22 rage, sacrificed is assuming maximum rage. If you want to have an idea of how much this does with regular mapping when you're not always capped on rage, you can drop this to like 15. The damage drops quite significantly, so you should try to minimize how much you throw your Rage Vortexes, and always try to be throwing them at max, because you'll see that you lose about like 20-30% of your damage if you are spamming it too quickly. On top of that, the enemy is Scorched, Brittle, and Sap. I said it's a maximum effect because it pretty much always is, and the enemy is intimidated thanks to the attack passive. Nearby enemies are intimidated while you have Rage. So my skills I have set up to emulate more realistic DPS without cheesing PoE stuff. So my Berserk is off. You can see my Berserk is disabled here. And my Val Ancestral Warchief is off and set to the regular one. So this has no flash either, and this is a pretty good indicator of how much damage you will be doing when your totems are up, you are unflashed, you are not berserking, and you aren't dropping your burst buffs. And so to emulate how much we actually have when we're bursting, which is you drop everything down at once and throw it on your Cyclone, or Rage Vortex. I keep calling it Cyclone. I'm going to turn on power charges because of Assassin's Mark, frenzy charges. Ancestral Warchief is on. Berserk is on. Intimidating Cry is on, so I'm going to do this with 100% chance to deal extra damage and extra modifiers. And if you manage to hit Warbringer for the next 4 seconds, you have 50% more attack damage. During your burst, you're looking closer to 140 million damage on a Pinnacle boss, which I think is pretty good. So I would say realistically, on a general mapping basis, you're probably going to be looking at closer to around 10 to 15 million just average DPS. And I think if you really wanted to push damage, the obvious answer is to put it in Abysses if you don't mind exploding, because this gives you a extremely absurd amount of damage. But I really like non-exploding randomly in maps, and I feel like this build already dies often enough as it is. It's not a hardcore viable build, and I don't think it's an SSF viable build. As squishy as is thanks to us playing Berserker, so I opted not to. You can choose to. You're going to look at a very expensive enchant to get this done, to get that 5% rage enchant on it, and you are going to bank on killing everything before it kills you, which is a perfectly viable playstyle, but it's not for me. As you can see, I try to balance out the amount of damage I have with fairly reasonable resistances, and I think if I were to buy anything, it would actually be a Progenesis to replace my Amethyst Flask, and really round out the tankiness of the build, because I find myself exploding randomly, and that would be a pretty good quality of life, though Abysses might solve that too. So I think aside from that, the build has pretty good solid single target damage. It's got pretty high attack and move speed thanks to 90 rage. I've only got move speed on my boots and nowhere else, and you can see I'm moving at a decent pace. You can focus on just snapshotting your buffs, Intimidating Cry, Berserk, and throw your Cyclone. And that will snapshot for the entire duration, so it'll last like 3 or 4 seconds. It'll shred bosses. But as far as the weaknesses go, the map clear is kind of lacking because you can only have one vortex at a time. And you can see that if I throw another one, the first one just gets deleted. which makes it feel kind of bad for mapping. And you can see that it goes in a straight line, so if your map isn't linear, you're going to suffer. This build is not great for clearing open layouts. It's good for clearing stuff out like Crimson Temple, which has a lot of corridors, or linear maps like Canyon or a beach. Additionally, it requires you to be aware of your rage at all times. You kind of got to pay attention, because if you're not paying attention to how much rage you have and you're throwing them at lower rage, your damage is going to be significantly lower. And so for you to capitalize, you got to make sure your buffs are up, your cry is up, and then you berserk at max rage before you throw. And that can be a lot to be aware of. But once you get used to it, the amount of damage you can output in your burst phases when your flasks are up is pretty good, as noted in the POB. So aside from that, I think if all of this sounds interesting to you, Rage Vortex is very, very viable all the way up until endgame. I don't think it's the strongest build you could play, but it is definitely fun as far as melee is concerned, and it's not Bone Shatter, so that's a plus. So if you end up playing Rage Vortex, I hope this helped you in the slightest, and hopefully I didn't talk your ear off too much. Thanks for watching.